welcome to Real Estate Resource. Really glad you stopped by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Hope you enjoy this video. Okay, so last week we got a little bit more than halfway through with the buyer representation broker compensation agreement. Again, this is in preparation for the coming changes because anytime that you represent a buyer, you will be required to have a buyer representation agreement signed prior to showing them properties. Now, that's coming in July, but you guys have got to start preparing yourself for how you present this to your buyers when you're doing your buyer consultations. And if buyer consultation is not something that you're currently doing, then it's also something that you've got to add into your business, where you're discussing with your buyers the process of purchasing a home, what it means for them, how compensation gets paid, what your value is to them as a buyer's agent, because you're going to have to negotiate how much you're going to be compensated for representing them, whether that ultimately gets paid by the seller, the listing broker, or by the buyer themselves. So you've got to be able to show true value to that buyer, because that's what's going to determine how much compensation you get. Now, that's coming sometime in July if this proposed settlement gets approved and goes through. Right now, nothing has changed. Zero. Your compensation is paid exactly the same. The listing agreements are the same. The purchase agreements are the same. The cooperating broker compensation forms exist. The MLS still shows compensation. All of that stuff that you've been dealing with your entire career is still in place. When and if and how it changes, nothing is changing until July. So until then, everything's the same. I have had conversation after conversation after conversation where people are saying, I can't get paid, right? My seller's not going to pay somebody, right? No, that's not how it works yet. Now, you may have sellers who, because they've heard some things on the news, they're going to say, well, we're not compensating people. And that's okay. It's not required to compensate in the MLS any longer. So you've got to still prepare yourself for how things work, which means you've got to change your listing presentations and explain to them how compensation works now and how it's going to work in the future, but as how it works now. And you've got to, again, be able to show value and to present to them why it's important for them to still want to compensate buyers brokers. Okay? Be able to show them the difference between non-compensation and compensation and what that's going to mean for them and the lack of exposure and how things are working. Look, days on market everywhere in our marketplaces are all hovering around 30 plus days, right? So if somebody wants to sell quicker than 30 days, they're going to have a lower price or maybe offer better compensation. If they're going to offer no compensation or very little compensation and have high prices, then they're going to be longer than those 30-day averages. Because remember, that's an average. So it means some things are going to be a lot longer than that. But we've got to be able to verbalize that to the clients and explain to them why. And again, I've said this last week, and I said it when we talked about the NAR settlement prior. The position that we're in based on this settlement is because us as professionals, we as professionals, did not do our job in explaining how compensation works. And because of that, we put ourselves in a position where consumers were able to find fantastic attorneys that were better than the NAR attorneys and better than the other attorneys that were involved in these cases, and they won the case. But whether or not we're mad at NAR for settling and changing how we do things, or we're upset about the idea of how compensation is going to work, we did it to ourselves. And I don't mean you guys that are particularly on this video, but in general, the real estate community did this to ourselves. Okay, that's my soapbox. Let's get back to learning how to use this form, okay? Because again, you're going to have to explain it. You're going to have to go through it. The better you learn it now, and it may change, right? It may change. There is quite a few people on here, so I'm not going to let you guys unmute yourself. If you have a question, please put it in the chat or raise your hand on, on Zoom, and I'll try to get to your questions as soon as possible. But with that, let me go ahead and share my screen with you guys. Okay. So what you should be looking at right now is paragraph 4G ish of the buyer representation and broker compensation form. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this in the last class. This is where we kind of finished. It's just like in a listing agreement. You know, if our listing agreement is either canceled or expired in this period of time that's written here, if that buyer were to go purchase a home that was introduced to them through us as part of this agreement in that period of time, then they may still owe us compensation. Again, it's all dependent on how the form was filled out. But we did talk about this last week. If you missed it at the end, it's towards the end of the video, and that's on YouTube, okay? Disclosure of anticipated payments. I'm not going to read it, but basically what it says is we have to disclose to our buyers if there is any anticipated compensation coming from either the seller or the buyer's broker or the seller's broker. Okay, so it says here, prior to writing an offer, or if we have the box check prior to showing the property. I would just leave it as the default right now. Prior to writing an offer, the broker will disclose to buyer the amount of compensation broker expects to receive from a third party. So with that, the form is the ABCD, and let me show you that real quick. Let's add that, and now we can take a look at it. So what this is us disclosing to our buyer any potential third-party compensation, okay? Third party meaning not them. They're not going to compensate us. Somebody else is going to compensate us for representing them purchasing the property, okay? So these are our buyers. This is the broker, the buyer's broker firm. Our license number needs to go in there. Your name, right, if you're the agent, is going to go here, your license number and the date. And then the buyers are going to sign this. They're going to acknowledge that they received it. And then they're going to initial next to each one of the properties. So you see here, so if let's say the property address we're going to show is 123 Banana Street, right? Whatever. We're going to put the address in. We're going to put the date that we're going to show it to them. We're going to show the compensation, either the percent of the price or a flat rate, and then we're going to tell them where that's coming from. Either the MLS is offering it, which is going to disappear in July, but right now it exists. The MLS is either offering it. We've got a CBC signed, a cooperating broker compensation, which is a form that says this is what the listing broker is going to pay us to represent you. Or if it's here, it's there's some kind of agreement. We're going to either put through the offer, through the SPBB, that the seller is paying that, and we're going to talk about SPBB in a moment, okay? So we've got to do this with every one of them, okay? So these are the addresses. These are the properties we're going to show. What we anticipate the compensation is going to be from the third party, okay? And then when we close escrow, we have to fill out this part. The final compensation, what it was, who it was, from the seller's broker, how much, or from who in the amount of, and then our information here, okay? So that's got to be included. So when I have a buyer representation agreement, not do I just have that, but prior to showing properties, I have to disclose to the buyers, or prior to writing an offer, I have to disclose to the buyers that I'm representing, this is the compensation that I am getting from someone other than you, okay? Questions? Let me go back up here to where we were. Any questions? No, I got a thumbs up though, like that. All right. Okay, so that's the disclosure. We're going to disclose that. We have to disclose it prior to, and then we disclose at the end what the compensation was. Timing of compensation. Compensation is payable upon completion of any resulting transaction, and if escrow is used through escrow. Brokers shall be entitled to compensation whether any escrow resulting from an agreement of property specified in paragraph 3 closes during or after the expiration of the representation period. So let's say that I'm representing you and we had a 180-day, a 6-month agreement for us to work together where you're going to compensate me, I'm going to represent you. And we get to the very last day of that agreement and write an offer and get it accepted. Now that agreement expires. that buyer representation agreement has expired, but now we're in escrow based on that agreement, you would still owe compensation even though that the agreement has expired. If acquisition is prevented by the buyer, by a default of the buyer on buyer's default, you would still owe me compensation, right? So if we get into escrow, you're moving right along, you remove all your contingencies, and then decide, I changed my mind and cancel, which is a buyer's default, then you would owe me compensation. Okay? And finally, if other than the buyer, some other party, which the only other party is the seller, were to cancel the agreement and the buyer were to recover damages, then the buyer would owe us compensation equal to our commission or 50% of the damages recovered, whichever is greater. Sounds a lot like the listing agreement, doesn't it? Right? We've talked about the compensation in the listing agreement. This is very similar to the way the listing agreement is done. Bertha, I saw you had your hand up for a moment, so let me unmute you. Go ahead.
Yeah, obviously it's gonna go paid through to C21 All Stars, right?
Of course, yes. Yeah,
Okay.
your broker. Yeah, whatever your broker for you guys on the call live right now. Yes, C21 All Stars. For anybody that's watching on YouTube later, yes, whatever broker you work for, the commission gets paid to the broker and then to the agent from there.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, okay. Charlie, go for it. Let's see. Go ahead, Charlie.
Hey, Kyle, who would pay escrow, say the buyer does default? Does escrow get paid or no?
Well, escrow has their own cancellation fees, so that's a whole other thing. If an escrow cancels, in their escrow instructions, they'll have some cancellation fee. I mean, it used to be as little as $250. Who knows what it is now? Prices have gone up. I think the majority of them are around $500 plus. I've heard of a couple escrows that are $1,000 for cancellation fees. So the escrow gets their own cancellation fee. They don't get paid the entire escrow fee if an escrow cancels. All right. So that's how you could get paid. That's disclosing compensation. Payment through escrow. Buyer hereby irrevocably assigns to broker the compensation provided for in this agreement from buyer's funds in escrow. Buyer agrees to submit to escrow any funds needed to compensate broker under this agreement. Broker may submit this agreement as instructions to compensate broker to any escrow regarding property involving buyer and a seller or other transfer. So that's it, right? This is my proof that I'm getting paid compensation. The buyer has to bring that money in, whether it's, however much it is, the commission's going to be. If the buyer is paying that commission, they have to bring it into escrow along with all their other funds they need to close. Very simple, straightforward. Pre-existing buyer representation and compensation agreements. If a buyer acquires a property during the time buyer is obligated to compensate another broker identified in paragraph 2, broker is neither entitled to compensation under this agreement nor obligated to represent buyer in such transaction. Just saying, hey, I don't have to represent you anymore. Okay. Let's see. Disclosure. This is the disclosure regarding agency relationships, just like in the purchase agreement or listing agreement. We've done that. Now, remember, once I've done this with my buyers at the very beginning, I sit down and I have my buyer consultation and I explain the process and how this works, how compensation works, and they sign the disclosure regarding agency relationships and they sign the PRBS, which is the next one. They don't have to sign another one. They don't have to sign another one. Okay, so when I write the offer, I know it comes with the offer. And that may change. That may change as we get to July when CAR starts making some changes to the forms to conform to the changes in practice. But as of right now, I have one agency disclosure regarding agency relationships. I don't need to complete another one every time we write an offer. Okay, so you only need the one. Broker authorizations and obligations. Again, this is really just saying, hey, look, we're going to represent you to the best of our ability. It tells you that we're going to give you a list of vendors, but we're not responsible for those vendors. Just like the listing agreement, the purchase agreement already talks about the buyers and brokers' obligations. The buyer obligations. Buyer agrees to timely view and consider properties selected by a broker and to negotiate in good faith to acquire a property. Buyer further agrees to act in good faith toward the completion of any contract entered into for a property in furtherance of this agreement. One of the nice things about this is this requires a commitment from the buyer, not just you. Like the way we've run our buyer representation lives is we're the ones that are committed. We've got to do everything we can to hold on to you. But hey, now I have a contract with you. We've agreed to work together contractually, not just because we shook hands and you seem like a nice guy. You are contractually obligated to now work within the terms of this agreement. Okay, and that's basically what it's talking about. Within 5 calendar days from the execution of this agreement, buyers shall provide relevant personal and financial information, including but not limited to proof of funds and a pre-approval, pre-qualification letter to broker to assure buyer's ability to acquire property. If buyer fails to provide such information, or if buyer does not qualify financially to acquire property, then broker may cancel this agreement in writing. So if I have my consultation prior to them meeting with my lender, then I would have the right to cancel if they don't qualify. The majority of us are either going to do our buyer presentation after they've been approved, right? Once we know what their buying power is, because if we don't know what their buying power is, it's very difficult for us to have a conversation about, is it plausible to purchase what it is that in their mind they want, right? If I don't know what you qualify for and you tell me, well, I want to buy a $800,000 house in Downey and I need 4 bedrooms or whatever the case is, and I do all of the work and start showing you properties, explain to you how the process works, do all that stuff, get you to sign this agreement, do my whole consultation, set up an appointment with the lender, and then all that, and then you qualify for $500,000 and you don't want to buy something for $500,000, like, well, I thought I was going to buy that. And especially after we've done a consultation, I've probably even got you more excited about the possibility of purchasing. So chances are you're not going to do this. I would say 99% of the time, you're not going to even fill out this form until they've spoken with a lender. Okay. So I suggest that part is probably not going to affect the majority of you or the majority of us as we use this form going forward. Okay. Reasonable care and other professional assistance. Buyer is obligated and agrees to read all documents provided to buyer. Buyer agrees to seek desired assistance from appropriate professionals selected by buyer, such as those referenced in the attached buyer's investigation advisory. Buyer is advised to read the attached buyer's investigation advisory and buyer transactional advisory for a list of items and other concerns that may warrant investigation by buyer or other professionals. Yes, Charlie, go ahead. Oh, sorry, I got to unmute you. I forgot. There you go.
Okay, thank you, Kyle.
Mm-hmm.
So what if, you know how in the first page there says that there's an option where both of you agree to not cancel?
Mm-hmm.
What if they don't review? What if let's say you have that in effect, right? They can't cancel by any means, and then they don't disclose their personal or financial information. Would this supersede that cancellation?
Yes.
Or no? Or you can't cancel anyways?
No, that
No
would
matter what.
supersede. They're if they don't provide you within 5 days the stuff that's in there, then they would be in breach of the agreement and you could cancel.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. I mean, let's think about this. You're probably not going. I'm hoping that what will happen going forward for us now, because we're going to have to change our standard of practice, and we're going to have to put ourselves in a position of actually interviewing buyers. I mean, the going back and forth of us, talking to buyers, and the only thing we care about is whether they qualify or not. We're going to have to take time to lay out to them the benefits of a buyer agent and how I, as a buyer's agent, am completely different than everybody else, or whatever value you're going to be able to sell them. But I would assume that in that process of getting somebody committed to signing an agreement, you're going to weed out a lot of those people that wouldn't have been cooperative like we've had in the past with buyers. We've all dealt with buyers in the past that are like, they don't answer the phone, they don't sign things on time, they don't deliver things when they're supposed to, they don't respond to emails, they're hesitant to do the things they're supposed to do, they're difficult with the lenders, they're difficult with escrow, they don't show up for their appointments with your transaction coordinator. We've all had buyers like that. We've had buyers where, we show them the perfect house and they don't run and write an offer. It's like they're afraid of the forms. So I think what's going to happen is by forcing us to get into a conversation prior to showing properties where we have to lay out the entire process and they actually have to sign a contract, those buyers that are just like, hey, let's give it a shot, let's go try to buy, they're going to be like, I'm out. I'm not going to do this. These are going to be committed buyers that are ready to go because they're going to have to say, if you don't get compensated somewhere else, I'm going to have to do it. So if that's part of purchasing, then I'm all in. So I think what's going to happen is, for us as agents, the quality of our skills with how we work with buyers is going to have to drastically improve. But the quality of buyers that you're going to work with is also going to improve. I think that we have to look at it that way. We're so afraid of looking at like, oh, buyers can't pay and they're not going to. Okay, maybe that does happen for a big chunk of the buyer pool. But the ones that are super committed, super motivated, qualify, and are ready to go, they'll pay. And they'll want a good agent to represent them. So in order for you to have access to that good pool of buyers when all of this changes, you better step up your game to be able to compete with the other agents that are also trying to get into that pool of buyers. So again, it's all perception of how we look at this. And I think spending this next 3 months really getting into the headspace of, this is how my business works from now on, it's this form, then you're going to be much better when July comes around. You're going to be much better prepared. Okay, so start working on that stuff. Be able to verbalize your skill and value. Really, really start working on that. Okay. Reports. Buyer agrees to pay for reports, investigations, and meetings arranged by broker on buyer's behalf. Buyer material issues. Buyer shall notify broker in writing. There's a form called the Buyer Material Issue, BMI, of any material issued to buyer, such as, but not limited to, buyer requests for information on or concerns regarding any particular subject interest of importance to buyers. So there's a form, and I would suggest that if you guys are going to start doing these buyer consultations, that becomes one of them, because it lets them also actively let you know, these are the things that are really important to me, and these are my no-goes. If I can't get this, I'm not going to do it, and if it has this, I don't want it, right? So I would suggest that, and we can, as a matter of fact, I think it's in here. We'll get to that in a moment. Dispute resolution. Just like the listing agreement, it's always mediation. Always mediation. Purchase agreement, always mediation. Even if we don't initial that dispute resolution clause in a purchase agreement, mediation comes first. So just like this, if there is some dispute between broker and buyer, right, over payment or whatever is the case, it has to go through mediation first. It has to go through mediation first, unless the amount of the dispute is less than, $10,000 for small claims court. Okay. These are the addendum that are attached already. Right, we already know the PRBS, we know the agency disclosure was checked earlier. The buyer's investigation advisory, just like on your purchase agreements, there's a buyer's investigation advisory, one is attached here, and the buyer transactional advisory, okay? Any other terms that you might need to put in here, don't know what could come up, but anything that you have to address that isn't addressed in the agreement previously, you would write in other terms. This is for if it's an entity buyer, right? If we're representing somebody who's buying using their trust or is a corporation, or a partnership or is a power of attorney, whatever the case is, we would check off that entity buyers. We would put the names of the people representing the entity here. In this case, this is not. If by chance you don't do that entity buyer portion prior to writing this and you need to amend it, you would then have to do an RCSD, the disclosure for the representative capacity signature, okay? Okay. Names, printed, signer, sign, everybody signs. That's our agreement, okay? That's our agreement. This is the buyer's transactional advisory. This form came with the change with the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement, okay? It references the BIA, which is the professional assistance we talked about earlier in the agreement. It talks about our agent's duties, or first of all, communicating important issues. Buyers need to notify to their agent in writing of any important material issues to them. That's the BMI form, right? I'll bring it up and look at it in a minute because it's not, I thought it was attached and it's not. Agent duties. Agents perform many services for buyers during the course of the home buying process. The sophistication of the buyers, the experience of others involved in a transaction, and the requirements of the specific transaction will all impact the agent's duties, right? So what is that saying? It's saying if you're a first-time home buyer, you don't know what I may have to do more things with you and for you to help guide you through the transaction. This is the 10th house you've bought. You probably need less from me, okay? So that's what they're saying is, based on who's involved and, you know, all the parties, maybe there's some more duties that the buyer's agent may take on because of the lack of knowledge that the buyer may have and who's guiding them through it, okay? Agent authorizations, obligations for property transactions of which agent is aware and not precluded from participating in by buyers during the representation period. Agents are authorized to provide and review forms to create a property contract for the acquisition of a specific property, deliver or communicate to buyers any disclosures, materials, or information received by, in the personal possession of, or personally known to the individual agent. Signing below. And if the property contains at least one but not more than 4 residential units, perform a reasonably competent and diligent visual inspection of the accessible areas of the 1 to 4 units and disclose to buyers any material facts concerning the value or desirability of the property that was observable in the inspection. Unless otherwise specified in writing, any information provided through agent in the course of representing buyers has not been and will not be verified by agent. Agent services are performed in compliance with federal, state, and local anti-discrimination laws. Agent owes no duty to inspect for common environmental hazards, earthquake weaknesses, or geological or seismic hazards. So what they're saying is like, look, my job, right, for you, the person signing this document, is anything that I find out about the property, anything I receive from the seller or another agent, any disclosures, I pass them on to you. I have to do a visual inspection on anything that is 1 to 4 units, residential 1 to 4 units. After that, I don't have to. So I am required to do that disclosure, that agent's visual inspection disclosure, and let you know what material facts may affect the value of the property for you. And I don't have to be the one that does any kind of special inspections for earthquake or anything like that. And we get those reports, but I don't have to check for permits. I'm not responsible for the structural integrity or anything else that affects the property that isn't disclosed to you from someone else. Okay? The scope of duties, it's been in other things. It's in like the statewide buyer and seller and all that stuff. So let's not read all of this stuff. But what it's basically saying is we're not responsible for. This is really what we're not responsible for and what we are responsible for. So things like I just said, I don't have to go look at permits. I don't have to do inspections. I don't have to go underneath the house. I just have to do a diligent visual inspection. I only have to give to you the things that I know. Any reports that are given to me, right? Any of those things. I'm not responsible for what's listed on the MLS by the listing broker. I'm not responsible for what they put in their flyers or any of their marketing. I'm not responsible for that. Tax advice, I can give you basics, but you got to go talk to a professional. Go talk to a CPA if you have questions about tax. Legal issues, I can tell you a little bit about, I could kind of guide you through this contract, but legal things that would affect you, like how you hold title or anything like that, you got to go talk to an attorney for that. It's not my responsibility. It's not my scope of duty. Okay. The buyer representation agreement allows for dual agency, and that's what the PRBS is. It says it allows for dual agency. The PRBS is there for you to grant that approval based on the disclosure that we gave you. And now the buyer signs that. That's just giving them a brief snippet of what's in the transaction, which is good for you because it's going to kind of give you a roadmap on what to discuss during your consultation when you're going over the process of them buying a property and how the transaction looks. Gives you a little roadmap, helps you out. So if you guys kind of get an idea of what this is saying and you can put it in a way that makes sense for you and for your client so they can understand how you're representing them and the things that you do, here you go. It gives you the opportunity. You don't have to make it up. It's there. They can tell you what to do. Buyer's investigation advisor, we've already been through this because it's attached to the RPA. Okay. That's consumer privacy. Same thing that we talked about in the RPA. All right, so here we talked about already the anticipated broker compensation disclosure. We've already talked about that. Any questions about the stuff that we've talked about already today? Anybody? No? All right. So let's look at us requesting for the seller to pay the buyer's broker, because that's what's going to happen now. Okay, so as we get to July, right, and we could just kind of recap briefly, the MLS will no longer have a place to offer compensation. There will be you will not be allowed to anywhere in the MLS state the seller is compensating the buyer's broker for representing the buyer. Nowhere. You won't be able to put it in private remarks, won't be able to do any of that. Can you state that the seller is willing to pay a certain amount of concessions to the buyer? Absolutely, you can. So if that seller chooses to say, hey, listen, we're selling this house for $600,000, a 2% commission on that would have been $12,000. I will offer $12,000 in concessions to the buyer to use however they want. Now, if that means the buyer uses it to pay their closing costs, so be it. If the buyer uses it to compensate their buyer's broker, so be it. But it has to state concessions. It can nowhere in anything that has to do with the MLS can it state that the seller is willing to compensate, that the listing broker is willing to compensate. Can't say that. Can't say that anywhere. Now, outside of the MLS, on my personal website, if I have my personal website that has all my listings on that listing I put on the website, by the way, I, as listing broker, am going to compensate buyer's broker 2% of the purchase price for commission. Or I put on my website, seller is going to compensate buyer's broker 1.5%, 2%, 3% for compensation for representing the buyer. I can do that. If I get a phone call as listing agent and it's from the buyer's agent, the buyer's agent says, listen, I got this fantastic buyer. I really think they would work well for you. Can you or your seller compensate me in some way? And if they say yes, absolutely, then I will put it in the purchase agreement. If it's on the website, I have to put it in the purchase agreement. That's perfectly legal. If we negotiate with the seller or with the listing broker compensation for us to cover the compensation that's owed by our buyers, that's perfectly legal. It just cannot be advertised anywhere in the MLS. So if I want to be compensated, I have to include this at this moment with the offer. It may change the way it's written come July, but this is how we're going to do it right now. Let's see what we got here. I guess the norm will be to always call listing agent and ask what the commission will be. Absolutely. That's what's going to be the norm. 100%. Anytime you're getting ready to show property, before you show the property, you're going to be like, are you or your seller paying any compensation? Yeah, absolutely. That will be the norm. Alba, go ahead. I saw you had your hand up. You don't have a microphone on, so I don't think you can unmute yourself. Don't think you have your audio turned on, Alba. You might want to type your question in the chat, and then I'll get to it, I promise. Okay, so the other thing, whatever compensation you have, and we'll go back to this so you guys can look at it. Whatever compensation in the buyer representation agreement that we have, so many forms, that we have written here, whatever that compensation is, right? Whether we have it on a different commission schedule or we have a percentage here, right? 2%, whatever it is, right? That is the maximum you can get paid. So if I have this agreement signed by my buyer saying they're going to pay me 2%, and I call Tony on the phone because he's got a great listing and I got a great buyer, and I say, Tony, are you or your seller paying any compensation? And he says, yeah, as a matter of fact, my seller really needs to sell, so we're paying 3%. When I send my offer with a copy of this buyer representation agreement and the contract that shows that the seller's going to pay the compensation, the maximum amount I can be paid is the 2% that my buyer and I have agreed on here. Not more. Not more. Period. End of story. That will be it. So I need, that's one of the things I think that ultimately, people start freaking out about. Because think about this. If I'm good with 1.5%, whatever, you negotiate. Remember, your value is what's going to ultimately dictate how much compensation your buyer agrees to commit to. Because if you don't get paid by somebody else, they got to pay it, right? So your value is going to dictate this amount of compensation. But what if you call the buyers, the listing agent, and they're like, well, yeah, they're willing to pay 3. Great, they're willing to pay 3. I'm only getting paid 2, so you're about to save 1% on that $600,000 for your seller. Let's get this deal going. Could that be a way to make your buyer more valuable? And maybe that becomes how people do it. Hey, we're going to renegotiate compensation because they're paying this much and you're going to pay that. You know what? A lot of things are going to change, and we're going to figure out how that works as we start getting into those changes. But yeah, your compensation is your compensation regardless of what's being offered. Okay, so before I go to Darwin, because Alba had a question, there's only one compensation that the buyer's agent can receive, right? Either from the buyer or the listing agent compensation. Yeah, well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, that's the maximum I could get is 2% right now because I have it written. But let's say, for example, that I've negotiated with my buyer to get 3%. And when I call Tony, the listing broker, and say, hey, listing broker, how much are you going to pay me? And they say 1.5%, right? Then we put that in the contract, fill the whole thing out. I get 1.5%. But my buyer would still technically owe me 1.5%. Now, I'm thinking there's some things we could do to change that. We could fill out our compensation schedule, this compensation schedule that we talked about right here. We could put in there that, hey, look, I don't want to punish my buyer. I'm going to take whatever compensation is being offered. That's what I'm going to get paid, which is what we do now, right? But if you wanted to, yes, you could still get paid by the seller and the balance of the 3% by the buyer. Darwin, I'm going to be with you, I promise. Could we do the opposite and put 3% and tell our client that we'd be okay with 2% if that is what's being offered on this? Yeah, yeah, we could, yes. All right, Darwin, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, something quick. So now the norm is going to be that every offer has to show what we're going to get paid. Either, like you say, the 2% or has to be the amount that and then we have to show it to the buyer. This is what I'm going to get from the seller, either seller. So every offer has to have the amount.
Yeah, well, I mean, that will be come July. But I mean, right now, though, if you do start using the buyer representation agreement, then yes, you will have to do that part now. But come July, for sure, you're going to have to do that. I would assume that they're still going to have that disclosure if there is some compensation being paid so that everything is transparent, right? Because the idea of the buyer representation agreement is you pay me, nobody else does. If somebody else is paying me, I've got to disclose to you because, like I just said, if you agreed to pay me 3 and somebody only pays me 1, you're still going to be responsible to pay me 2. But I still have to disclose where that compensation is coming from. Go ahead, Alba.
Kyle, if we have our buyers that sign a buyer's representation agreement, for example, let's say in June, mid-June, and we're still not able to find a home for the buyer in July, once this comes into effect, will we have to do another seller representation contract?
But yeah, I would assume yes, because things are. It's hard to say. I can't say 100%. I would say it's probably yes. You'd have to redo it because the terms of the contracts are going to change. I'm sure the RPA is going to change. I'm sure these sellers' payments and all those forms that we're talking about right now, there's going to have some slight tweaks and things that are going to be removed because there will be no more MLS compensation. So I would probably guess, even if it isn't mandatory to change, that we do it, right? Okay. Just to make sure that everybody's on the same page and that we're not outside of any of the requirements, just to make sure. That's all.
And then just kind of explain to them that it's going to take effect in July and we might have to do another contract.
Yeah, and I think here's the thing too is that I
know it's so soon to like all of this in effect, and
but it's not that soon. We forget how fast things move. I mean, we're already done with the first quarter of the year. That went by like this. So July is going to be here before we know it. So the more we're prepared for those changes that may come, because again, we're almost certain these changes are going to happen. I would be like, 99% they're going to happen. I don't see any reason why the judge is going to throw out the settlement proposal, right? But a court still has to approve all these, and that's why they say these things will happen in July. So they could happen in July. Maybe they happen a little bit later. Maybe it gets thrown out and we got to go back to the drawing board, and who knows? I don't know. Nobody knows. But what we do know is that if we're prepared for when it does happen, because it's probably going to, then we can make those kind of adjustments as we get there, because we've already put ourselves in a position where we understand the processes of working with a buyer. Like I said, you may not have to change because you've already done what you're supposed to. You've disclosed to your buyer what compensation you're getting. You've disclosed to the buyer how compensation works. You have a buyer representation agreement. You're negotiating compensation with the seller. So there's probably not going to be a necessity to do it. I just think that maybe for us to just be as clear and transparent as possible, we make those adjustments when those changes happen.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Go ahead, Marisol.
Okay. So if we use this seller payment to buyer's broker, would that still be a credit to the buyers, or would it be considered separate?
I'm sorry. Hold on. I missed it. What was? Start the question again. I apologize. It was breaking up a little bit.
If we are using this form, the seller payment to buyer's broker, is that considered a credit towards the buyers, or it would be?
No, not if we're doing it through here. No, okay. because the seller is committing to pay the compensation to the broker. If you're doing it as a concession, like what you can list in the MLS, then yes, that is a credit to the buyer, and the buyer then has to disclose that to the lender and then pay us and pay their closing costs and do all that stuff with it. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Let's see, we got here. So if you originally agreed to 3, but then the listing agent pays us 2, and you want to cut the buyer break and don't want to make them pay the difference, is there another form to explain you will no longer request payment from them? No, what I would do is you would probably just do a modification. So there's a form that's called modification of listing, buyer representation, or other agreement. right? So it's used for modifying your listing, whether it's changing the price, changing the commission, or extending the date of the listing. Same thing with your buyer representation agreement. So let's say, for example, hey, seller's going to pay me, like we didn't address it already, saying whatever compensation I get from a third party is going to relieve you of your duty to pay. Let's say we didn't do that. And now I got it. Hey, look, I'm getting 2%. I don't want to charge you. So we're going to do a modification of the buyer representation agreement that says that your compensation to me is 2%. That's it. Let's see, Melvin, if we're taking a listing right now, if you're taking a listing right now, do exactly what you would do yesterday or a year ago. Exactly the same. Keep doing exactly the same thing. Look, if you sign a listing agreement today, whether or not it becomes in July where the seller is not obligated to pay any compensation, doesn't change the fact that they agreed to pay compensation today. It's just going to change if you take a listing today and for some reason it doesn't sell until after July. It doesn't change the fact that they have agreed to pay compensation. What changes is how you're going to handle the payment of the compensation or how it's addressed in the purchase agreement. That's the only thing that's going to change. But if you're taking a listing right now, if you're working with a buyer right now, it's business as usual. Just continue to do what you've been doing. As of today, there are listing agents using this to their advantage, stating they don't have to pay a buyer broker. Sure, I'm certain that there are some weak listing agents out there that are running around going, "Hey, you don't have to pay anybody but me now, so let's go ahead and list your property because it's going to cost you less." They're the same shitty agents, part of my language, that were charging 1% for a listing agreement because that was the only value they had to a seller. So yeah, I'm sure there are agents that are out there taking advantage of this right now. That's not what we have to concern ourselves with, because before there was no compensation to the buyers, before that was even a notion, we still had to fight with those garbage agents that only charged 1% and didn't have any value. You've just got to be able to demonstrate your value and why the idea of a seller paying compensation to a buyer's broker is important to them in the process of selling their home. If you can't verbalize that, then you're going to have a hard time with listings. That's it. Yeah, you're going to tell them you're not required to. And if you don't want to, this is going to be the process of selling your home. And it's probably going to change the amount of time it takes and the amount of money that you're going to earn. If you want to pay a small commission, this is going to change this is how it's going to affect the time it takes. And this is how much it's going to affect how you're going to earn. Now, if you want to pay a going rate commission that most buyers are looking for in their compensation, buyers agents, then this is what I believe the time to sell and the amount you're going to sell it for will be. But if you can't verbalize those things to the seller, if all you say is, well, then you're supposed to pay, then you're going to be in trouble. So again, you got to start working on your skills, guys, and you got 3 months to do it. So I'd say get busy. So looking at this seller agreement, it's saying the buyer and the buyer's agent have already entered into a buyer representation agreement, the BRBC. That we already went over that. Buyer has an obligation to pay buyer's broker compensation pursuant to that agreement after first deducting any amount that buyer's broker will receive from seller's broker through the MLS or other agreement, right? So that's probably going to be gone in July. But this one is buyer is asking seller to pay buyer's broker all or a portion of the balance due buyer's broker under the representation agreement. So what we're saying is that, look, seller, I've agreed to pay my buyer's agent 2% of the purchase price. I'm going to ask you now to pay that 2%. That's it. Now, this is probably going to disappear. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. This is the buyer representation. Okay, let me start over. I went to the wrong place. This is the buyer representation agreement. Buyers entered into an agreement. We've agreed to 2%, right? That's what we agreed on our BRBC. Compensation from seller's broker to buyer's broker. That's the MLS. Probably going to be gone because the MLS will not offer compensation anymore. But let's say that at this point, right, that the broker is going to pay 1%. So that means there's a balance of 1%. I'm going to ask for check the box. I'm going to ask the seller to pay that balance of the 1%. Right? You see the math? Now, with this being gone, if I want the seller to pay my entire compensation obligation, I'm going to put 2% there, and I'm not going to put anything here because there is none. Right? So this is my request of the seller to pay my compensation to my buyer's agent. And you could address that in the offer just like anything else. Let's say that they're willing to take $650,000 for their property, and the compensation amount for the buyer is going to be, for the buyer's agent, is 2% of that 650, which is, what is that? That's $13,000, right? So if that's the case, I'm going to write the offer for 663, and instead of paying 2%, I'm going to go right here and I'm going to put $13,000 or whatever the compensation is, right? Or the 12,000, whatever the compensation. I don't know why that jumped around like that. I'm going to put whatever the amount of the compensation of that sales price would be in there as a flat rate amount, because I'm writing the offer over to get them to pay that amount. Does that make sense, guys? So this is how I'm going to request from sellers how they're going to pay. It's going to be addressed in the purchase agreement for the first time. I know I used to tell you guys all the time, you can't counter commissions, you can't do all that stuff. That's not the case. That's not going to be the case come July. Let me see what we got here in chat. If you get a listing now paying both commissions, does not sell until June or July and still in contract by then, can the seller cancel contract and sign a new one? No. The contract is still the contract. They've agreed to pay compensation. If they were signing a new one, no. I don't see any reason how the seller can say, oh, I'm canceling now because the rules changed. No, we have an agreement that goes beyond the rule change. And just because you're not obligated to offer compensation doesn't mean that you get to stop offering compensation if you've already agreed to do that. So no, I don't see that being a change, but who knows? Sellers might try to, but again, this goes back to your skills and how you explain how the process of compensation works and what the benefits are to it. And if you can't do that, then you're going to have some difficulties. All right, so we went through those forms to help you guys get prepared. Again, those forms are probably going to change slightly. There's going to be differences in the RPA. There's going to be differences in the listing contract. There's going to be differences in this request. There's going to be some changes. That's going to happen, and we don't know what those look like yet because they haven't even begun. But if you guys can get yourself into the habit of starting this part of the process, which is the consultation and the agreement, because you're going to have to in July. So you're either going to have 3 months to learn how to do it, or you're going to be forced to do it in July, and you're not going to know what to do because you failed to do it in the next 3 months. So that's, I would get really prepared. I'd really, for you guys, it would be super important that you add this to your process of working with a buyer, that every one of your buyers already starts using this buyer representation and broker compensation agreements, so that you start to become really good at it and very fluid and comfortable with the form, because otherwise you're going to get punched in the gut come July because you're going to be forced to use it and you're not going to know how to. Okay. Yes, Mireya, go ahead. Let me ask you to unmute. Sorry. Oops, wrong one. Mireya, go ahead.
Hi, Kyle. Sorry if this is a new agent question, but so currently when you go out now to do to sign a listing agreement, are you saying we should now take the buyer's agreement too and have them sign both if they're planning to purchase another home?
Wouldn't be a bad idea. Wouldn't be a bad idea. That's the process now, right? Is if you're going to start practice, because come July, that's what you're going to have to do. You're going to have a buyer representation agreement with your contingent buyers. So wouldn't be a bad idea to start learning that process of how I'm going to present it, because now I'm presenting where I'm asking you to compensate me for selling your house, and I'm going to have to ask you to compensate me for buying a house. So it might not be bad to get into the habit of having those conversations so that you guys aren't caught off guard come July when you do have to have it. So good question, Maria. I like that. Anybody else before I let you guys go? So obviously this is not going to be the last time we have these discussions between now and July. And as new things happen and changes start, maybe CAR starts making some changes and propose changes and have some drafts to forms. As soon as I have access to those, I'm going to share those with you. Hold on, we got a couple more questions here. If buyer is willing to pay compensation and they only have enough for down payment and closing costs, is that going to affect their loan approval? Well, yeah, they're not going to be able to. If they don't have the money, if they only have the money for their down payment and closing costs, if they don't get some kind of a credit or help with the money from the seller, then yeah, they're not going to be able to pay their buyer. So, okay, again, as anything comes out, I'm going to try to bring it to you guys as soon as possible, you know, once I understand it as best I can. And I really appreciate you guys being here. I love that we had as many people as we did on the class. Again, later on today, this will be on YouTube. So if you missed any part of it, you can look at it there, and you can look at all of our look at all of our past videos on that YouTube channel too. So thank you guys for being here. I really appreciate it. Have a fantastic day.